So hello everybody, you're very welcome to this talk entitled Hearts and Minds, looking in particular at psychological factors in cardiac care. So my name is Noelle O'Keefe. I'm a senior counselling psychologist and I work in the cardiac rehab service at Tala University Hospital. So I work by doing these particular types of talks, and I also work individually with people where they may feel that some individual work might be of support to them. So the talk that I'm going to give today, I know the audience has kind of people who may have recently had a cardiac event, people who may have a diagnosis, people who may have had an operation with one stent, or people who may have had a massive heart attack. So what I would ask you in this talk is to see what resonates with you, see what makes sense. Some of it will really tap into your experience, and some of it may not. So really just take the pieces that are of relevance to you. As most of the content of this talk, it's built from my experience of working with patients who have had cardiac issues, health issues. So it's very much a sort of a relaying what other people also have reported that they've gone through after some type of a cardiac event. So I suppose one of the things is you wonder, we think a little bit about why would psychology be involved in cardiac care? And one of the things is it's very well known and understood at this point of time in the world of psychology and cardiology and in therapy in general is that the heart, the mind are interlinked, and the body is interlinked. So the mind, the heart, and the body. So for example, if I have the flu, physically I don't feel great, but I probably will be quite low in my energy in my mind. I might be a bit cranky. I might be irritable. Equally, if I'm in very bad form about something, if I feel very cross or irritated about something, I might notice that I don't have a lot of energy in my body. I might not want to go for that walk after work that I usually might do. So automatically we can see that the body affects the mind and the mind affects the body. And I suppose in particular, the heart is in the middle of all of that. So it is linked greatly with our emotional system. We talk a lot about the heart and heartache, or the heart filled with joy. So it is linked with that sense of both the mind and the body need to be accounted for and taken care of for heart wellness. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is the sense of heart wellness. And sometimes when people have had a diagnosis or a cardiac event, they may feel a type of a disconnect from the heart. So we're trying to work towards coming back to the heart, coming home to your heart and minding it in a way that feels useful and possible for you. So I suppose when we think a little bit about psychology, as I said, it's linked, but what we know is that psychological factors and reactions are a part of that mind-body connection. And we know that that particular connection can contribute to cardiac events. So, for example, we know that when people can be very stressed, it can affect their heart. It can tighten the chest area. But equally, we know that psychological factors and reactions are a part of dealing, perhaps with a diagnosis, perhaps with an attack, perhaps with an operation. And that is probably more of what I will focus on today, is what do people go through after they are diagnosed with something. So first and foremost, just to kind of briefly go back a bit, and what do I mean by psychological factors? Why would they play a part in adjustment to a diagnosis or an event? So the psychological factors I'll refer to are how the mind works, how the psyche works, how motivated a person is, how a person becomes motivated. So for example, with yourselves, some of you may feel very motivated as a result of a diagnosis to say, okay, what can I do to make this come back in line? Other people may say, but is it not too late? I mean, they may feel a lack of motivation because something has happened. So it's really important to know what's your style of motivation, okay? What's your attitude to heart conditions? What's your attitude to health? Do you feel it's something that the doctors or the nurses will tell you how to do? Or do you feel like a strong factor, a strong contributor in managing your own health and your own recovery? So it's really important to think, how do we think about things? What do we believe about illness? And so on. Other psychological factors are how we cope. So the strategies we use in dealing with things in life. We all have strategies. Um, we've learned them very young. And sometimes those strategies continue very well for us. Other times those strategies, they actually don't. So for example, one I hear commonly in patients with cardiac issues is um, they find themselves accommodating people very much. So they're not very good at saying no sometimes to other people's requests. But then something happens and they find, I don't really have the energy. I don't have the resources to keep saying yes. But they might be very used to saying yes to people. So their work may be around as developing a new strategy, which is, well, if I say yes to you about something, I might be saying no to myself. And right now I need my energy for myself. So we look a little bit at some of those strategies. We also think in psychological factors about how we manage difficult events. So when something happens, what's the outlook that we take? Is it something dreadful? Is it something to be noticed and moved on from? Is it a blessing in disguise? Is it a wake-up call? Um, and equally, this can affect how easily or not that we move on from something. Or a word I prefer to use is how more easily that we integrate what has happened. So you'll often hear people talk about accepting a condition. I think acceptance is a very difficult thing to do. I like to think more along the lines of how do you integrate this new condition? Okay, so first we need to understand what's your view of it in your life. I suppose one of the things, psychological factors that is a part, and as a psychologist, I always, would bear in mind when dealing with anyone is what is their history of loss or trauma in their life. So what degree of perhaps childhood issues or undealt with issues, probably a more accurate way, um, how much of a factor are they in a person's recovery? Okay, because what we do know is that when there's a diagnosis or a cardiac event, it is not uncommon. It doesn't always happen, but it's not uncommon for people to, for old wounds to open up. Okay, because when we're ill, there's a vulnerability, and that can often tap off the vulnerabilities that we carry day to day. So that's often a factor that has influence. And I suppose finally, one of the psychological factors that's of relevance is how do we deal with adversity and what's our degree of resilience? So that sense of resilience being something, but how do we bounce back? How do you understand this event in your life and how do you continue to function with it in your life, but not to be overwhelmed by it? And overwhelm can come initially, that's completely understandable. It's how does it move through your system so that you can function? So there's two particular things also in psychological reactions that I consider in terms of cardiac care. So when something can happen to somebody, there is an immediate reaction of something needs to be done. That might be going to the hospital, that might be ringing people, that might be an immediate appointment for the cardiac rehab. So quite quickly, our stress response kicks in. And that's really useful initially because it's what gets us to the doctor. It's what gets us to the operating table. And it's that part of alertness that says something's wrong here. This doesn't feel right. And you will have seen that a lot with COVID-19 of this time last year, which would have been April of last year. People were quite alerted. There was quite a lot of stress in the country because there was a threat. There was a problem that needed attention. Okay. And that does actually happen when someone has had a cardiac event. There has been a threat to your physical health. And so you are galvanizing your resources to understand this. What do I need to do next? What's the meds I need to take? Am I able to go for a 2-kilometer walk? Can I only manage 1 kilometer? So these are all very alive. I suppose over time, that stress response system, while it's really functional in the shorter term, it is not in the longer term. So it can move into a place of chronic stress, which is what you want to avoid. You want to move into the next system, which is more the caregiving system. So if the stress response system goes up, then the caregiving system needs to bring that down. And that's the part of things like listening to talks like this or attending your GP or your doctor, where you start to learn, okay, this heart condition needs minding. It does not need your stress. It actually needs your care and attention, like you would a child who might have the flu. Okay? And that particular caregiving system is the one that works on reducing your heart rate. It is the one that heals the body. So you want to move into that place sooner rather than later so that your heart has the best condition under which to recuperate. One of the psychological reactions that can occur when there's a sudden diagnosis, a sudden operation or something, is the impact of trauma. So whatever brings you to this talk today, we can know that in some way the rug got pulled from underneath you. Now, when the rug is pulled from underneath us, we're upside down. Things do not feel the way they should feel. Life seems a little bit unpredictable. That sense of safety that we have day to day is gone. And that is what traumatic experiences elicit within us. And I suppose part of this talk and why I do it for people is to help them to recognize that, to begin to turn it off, okay? And that can manifest in sleepless nights, it can manifest in low mood, it can manifest in hypervigilance, watching, and that's not unusual and it's not wrong in the immediate aftermath of a diagnosis or an event, okay? I would expect that in plenty of circumstances. It's if it continues for longer, we need to look at it more closely. And so I suppose then moving on a little bit more to what I will share more of today is the emotional experiences that people go through when they have some type of a diagnosis or an event. And I'll talk a little bit more about those because there is a wide range of those. So I suppose one of the things around psychological elements in cardiac care is that we do know that how our mind has a chemical effect on our body. So right now, if I think to myself as I give this talk, oh dear, this is going very wrong. I'm not really sure if I'm giving across the right information. What will these people think? What will the feedback be like? If I'm kind of panicking in my mind, straight away my heart rate goes up. My hands get a little sweaty and I can't think so clearly. So there's an actual chemical reaction of adrenaline moving through my body, which is uncomfortable for my body. If I say to myself, look, I'm giving this talk to the best of my ability, I will share the information that I have. Some people will benefit from it. Some people will think that wasn't quite for me, but I'll do the best I can. Straight away, my heart rate reduces. I can think clearly. I can speak more coherently. And that's nicer for my body. And that's the position you want to be putting your body into. So you want to feed the psychological experiences. You want to feed the self-talk in a way that produces a reaction of gentleness within your body. Okay? Because that is the goal. And that is how the body can heal itself, is when the inner environment is in a calmer position. And I suppose in particular, as I've given the example, the heart system, the cardiovascular system is central to how our emotions and our states of mind impact on our physical body. Because as I said, quite quickly, my heart rate went up. Okay, so the cardiovascular, I mean, it is in the middle. It's in the middle of the mind and the body. So it is about creating the best position for that to be in terms of its rate, its heart rate, and its capacity to manage what goes on in your mind. Okay. So as I mentioned, in a cardiac event, many thoughts and feelings can emerge. For some, that happens right away. And for others, it can take time to emerge. And I'll mention a little bit later that I'm seeing in COVID-19 that some of those reactions are emerging a little bit later because people are not in contact with the services as much or as quickly as they ordinarily would be, for example, with a cardiac rehab program. But I'll come back to that. I would say to people, there is no right or wrong way to feel after an event, whether that event is a diagnosis, whether you had an operation where you had 1 stent, 5 stents, or whether you were brought in an ambulance with the alarm, with the siren going. It is, how does this event land into the system of each individual? Okay, that is what makes the difference. And there is no right or wrong way to feel, nor is there a way for me to predict who'll react in what way. Okay, but what I would say to people is, don't invalidate your reaction by saying, but sure, it was only 1 stent, or he had it worse, he was, had a cardiac arrest, different things like that. pay homage, I suppose, or honor the piece, the part about what happened to yourself. Some people, they're barely affected by it emotionally. For others, it can really shake them. It can be really a turning point. For some people, it's quite traumatic. And this is what we're trying to kind of get ahead of, is that people will understand what is kind of a normal emotional reaction in the context of something like that happening. So again, I'll go back to COVID-19. It was very normal this time last year for people to be anxious, for people to be worried, for people to not know what was happening and feel uncertain. It was completely normal. And so it's the same if someone has a cardiac event. We know there's certain ways that people will react, and we can understand it, and explain to people, well, that's because this just happened. It's not that you're going mad. It's that you're reacting. Your system is reacting to something. Okay? So the types of reactions that people have told me about in my working years in cardiac care is that there can be a lot of numbness and shock. So initially the shock of like, what's just happened? But also people can feel like a little bit numb, like, is this really happening? This can't be real. And in particular, because physical medical care is so rapid, it's not unusual for someone to go in, have an operation, have a heart attack, and be home within 3, 4, 5, 8 days. So it takes longer for our emotional psyche to catch up with that physical change. So it can feel like, did last week really happen? So it takes a while for the rest of us to land, the rest of ourselves to actually say, okay, this is where things are at now. Some people would talk about feeling angry that this happened to them, maybe angry with their body or betrayed or disappointed with their body. Um, and that questioning of, well, why did this happen? But equally, some people would feel guilt that, well, I had some of the risk factors, I should have known better. I hear that from people. So there's those types of reactions that occur. And for some, it can be confusion and abandonment. So as I said, you come in, you have your operation, a lot of focus on you while you're in hospital, and then you go home and you wait for the outpatient appointment, or you wait for the cardiac care or rehab appointment. And that time in between, people talk a lot about feeling lost, feeling like this big thing has just happened to them in that big hospital over there, and now they're at home and they don't know which way to turn. And that's quite scary, because even though I work in cardiac rehab care, and so does, the nurses and whatnot, and we're dealing with people all day, every day, those people don't know all of those other people. Okay. So for them going home, it's like, what's just happened? How do I do this now? How do I live now with this condition? So I suppose that's probably one of the more common ones that I hear, of that sense of confusion. Like, how do I do this? For some people, there can be a lot of anxiety. Is this going to happen again? Not wanting to push themselves too much, maybe isolating a little bit. And I suppose that is where it's important to work with the team around understanding what are you able for, okay? Because it's very hard when something like this happens. People, their confidence can get knocked, and therefore it is hard for them to then learn what they're able for, okay? And that's the purpose of a healthcare team, is to say, no, actually, you are well able for 2 kilometers or 5 kilometers, okay? People have talked to me about feeling like they're afraid of going to sleep and will they wake up? And that's not unsurprising. And for some people who might have been in the intensive care unit, they have that as well. So I suppose there's that fear of trusting your heart. Is it going to keep going during the night, and am I going to wake up? Okay. Others talk about an awareness of their body, an increased awareness. So like that, if my heart rate goes up, I'm not going to worry that I'm going to have a heart attack because I don't have a heart condition. For others, it might be, oh, do I need to get this checked out? Or what's this odd feeling there around under, in my breastbone or something. So people become aware of the physicality of them. And for some, it can be awareness of the physical limitations. Some people are afraid they won't return to themselves. And I suppose it's one of the things that can be difficult, is because we don't often think about the fragility of our bodies, because we kind of think, well, it'll just keep going. And then you're met with a limitation, or my next point, you're met with a vulnerability. And that's really hard for humans to tolerate, being vulnerable. And also being in the hands of medicine, it requires people to give themselves over to someone else for care and treatment. And people sometimes can feel helpless or they might feel powerless um, in that situation because it is an unusual situation. For some people would talk about their family members wrapping them in cotton wool, and there is a wrapping in cotton wool that can happen. I suppose you don't always want to be in that position, okay? But it's not unusual for people to feel that vulnerability, and it's not always a pleasant feeling to feel vulnerable. Okay, it scares us quite a lot. Brené Brown has a lot of work on being brave and being vulnerable, and she talks about being brave enough to be vulnerable. Okay, so it's not a condition that we orient towards, but all of a sudden you might find yourself thrown into it. Some people would talk about gratitude and relief. They see it as a wake-up call, perhaps. They're grateful for another chance. They might feel very grateful to the staff that worked with them. They might feel relieved, well, this has been caught. You know, I can do something about it now. So there is positive emotions as well as anything else. One of the ones I come across quite a bit is tearfulness, sadness, and grief. And tearfulness seems to be quite a common one because, as I would see it, the heart is opening. The heart is cracked a little bit, and it's like it's cracking emotionally, and the tears are often the language of the heart. So don't be frightened by those tears because they are trying to express something. And often we think, oh, crying is a weakness. It's not. It's the way the heart needs to release something. For some, it connects them with old wounds. And as I said, it can link with your vulnerability or mortality because, we don't talk about vulnerability in life. We don't talk about our mortality. And if anything, COVID-19 has allowed people to talk about feeling afraid, feeling vulnerable, feeling, will they be next? Do you know? For some, as I said, they might reevaluate. It's a brush with death for some, or it's a brush with mortality. And they can look at what's important, what needs to be changed. And we talk a little bit about post-traumatic growth when something like this happens, that when you're in the throes of it, you think, oh, why me? Why did this happen? But as you move through, we would hope you would get to a place of what can be better because of this? Okay, what can improve in my life on the strength of that happening? You might find that you're far more resilient than you ever were. You might realize, okay, now is the time to do this thing I've always wanted to do. Okay. And I suppose what I would say is it's useful to understand that others who've gone through the cardiac program that I work in, they've reported these reactions. I have made none of those reactions up, I promise you. I suppose I would hope that you would find reassurance from the fact that others have experienced that if you're also experiencing it. It's not unusual and it's not problematic. It's if it continues for a long portion of time that we look at it differently, okay? So I know not everybody watching this will be in a cardiac rehab program, but for those of you that are, or those of you who are thinking about it, this is what I would suggest that cardiac program is useful from the psychological perspective. So yes, you do exercise. Yes, you learn about diet. For me, as a psychologist, it's about linking, with people who have been through the same thing at the same time. One of the things that the government tapped into last year when asking for lockdowns and during the pandemic was we were all in it together. Nobody was immune from COVID-19. It didn't matter how much money you had. It didn't matter your education. We were all in it together. And you will have seen very early last year of a camaraderie in the country, a pulling together, lots of, fundraising for frontline workers. There was the clapping one particular evening. So it's really important when something goes wrong that you can find a location of people that kind of know what you're going through, because we like to belong as humans. We like to have a tribe. So linking with something like a cardiac rehab program gives you a linkage with people who know what you're going through at the time. And that really helps humans to settle down again. For me, from a psychological point of view, the rehab program provides a structured pathway through recovery. You're not really meant to know how to get through a cardiac event because it might not be your job. So the cardiac rehab program shows you, well, actually, when someone has a diagnosis, when someone has a cardiac event, this is a tried and proven way of how to recover, okay? So like that for humans, they really like to know, well, okay, this has gone wrong. What do I do to improve things? that settles our set. We like routine, we like predictability, we like to know what's going to happen next. And I suppose one of the things is it creates an opportunity to gain confidence about your body. And I would say to anyone with any type of a diagnosis, cardiac otherwise, become your own healthcare clinician. Learn about the heart. Learn about its own tweaks and twinges for yourself so that you gain confidence that tightness in the chest does need investigation, or that tightness in the chest that just feels I'm a little bit anxious today, or I just ran up the stairs, so that you start to have a confidence around what your body is actually able for and to understand it. Equally with medication, with appointments, you know, it's okay to ring the outpatient department and say, when am I coming in next? People often feel I have to wait for the invite, I have to wait for the letter. It's perfectly fine to ring up and say, what week am I coming in? I suppose, as I said, learning about your heart health, knowing what to do, taking ownership restores confidence. Information is power. Okay. Some of the stats, I suppose, just to say, about a third of people, it's understood, don't get affected very much emotionally. Okay. It might be a little bit like water's off a duck's back. Other people take a little bit longer. They're more pensive and reflective of why this and why now. And family and friends, other people who maybe in the rehab program or healthcare professionals can be of great benefit to assisting that person. And then there's about another third that I might actually work with as a psychologist. So that might be cases where those feelings, perhaps of anxiety, of depression, low mood, of kind of re-experiencing the event, don't shift naturally, okay? And I would work with people to assist in moving that through, okay? So as I said, I suppose the reactions that I've named, they're not uncommon after something happens. They're not a sign of weakness, and they don't have to become a problem, okay? And I think what's really important is how quickly we label things like low mood as being depression. Well, low mood after something big happens is actually a normal reaction to something big happening. So there's something about really understanding what you're going through in a context. Okay, it doesn't mean that you don't avail of help, but it's also about not doubling up on diagnoses, to be honest with you. As I said, some of them are unpleasant. I can't take those emotional reactions away from you. But actually, if they're part of the picture and you recognize this is it's not nice, it's not very comfortable, but it will pass, that helps you to tolerate them, okay? And then they settle. When your emotions get validation, they settle, okay? As I said, with the COVID-19, this year people have settled. They might still, be following all the guidance and whatever, but there's a level of panic that has gone. I mean, it's probably replaced right now with burnout. But overall, it's a little bit about helping things to settle. The nuggets to recognize them, validate them, and soothe them. What kind of a nice thing can you do for yourself if you're having a low mood? How do you soothe yourself if you are grieving for the body that you thought you had, but is quite different now, perhaps? So it's about attending to those parts of yourself as you would to a child, as you would to a friend, if they were upset about something. And that's probably the best thing you can do is, well, how would I talk to my friend if they just had this event? Okay. Something has occurred that has really rattled your system. Otherwise, you wouldn't be listening to this talk tonight. It takes time for that to land. Okay. I suppose what helps is recognizing and reflecting on what has happened, giving it the time and the attention. Being kind to yourself as a way of soothing. So I gave the example at the start of if I talk to myself really critically, this will be a really hard talk to do. If I talk to myself kindly, my whole system is calmer and it is easier for me to do this talk. The same for you. It's like, how can I be gentle and kind with myself so that my system is calmer, because then you will heal quicker. Talking to yourself, they talk in Buddhism about the first arrow being the heart diagnosis. The second arrow, and you can't control that, it's happened. The second arrow is how you view it, how you talk to yourself about it. So being very critical to yourself. The heart emotionally sees self-criticism as an attack, okay? So it's about, how do I talk to myself gently and say, okay, this has happened. Maybe I saw it coming. Maybe I didn't see it coming. So what can I do now? It's not about blaming myself, but what can I do now to assist my heart in recovery? Breath work is very helpful. Learning to breathe deeply into the belly. A lot of people with cardiac conditions can breathe quite high up in their chest. Breathing down into the belly settles the system, okay, and equally brings in much more oxygen, reduces feelings of anxiety. Sharing with others, so be it through a cardiac program, be it through an organization, the experience that you have, so that you get to kind of get the measure of, God, that person's similar to me, or God, should I be further along? As I said, we look for tribes in things like this. So I'm just going to get you to do a quick exercise with me. I'm going to put my hand here on my heart. You might not be able to see it. And we call this the heart soothing touch. And as you bring your hand to your heart, we know there's an awful lot of nerve endings around the heart. If you think of a baby, where do you put a baby when they're first born? Onto the mummy's heart. So that is an area that creates great calm. So just very gently allow your hand to connect with your heart and just see how it lands there. Is it warm? Is it cool? Is it weird? What's she doing this for? Maybe you're thinking, that's all right. But it's a way of your hand, connecting with the heart. It's like wanting to communicate with the heart, because the heart also is trying to communicate. It's trying to let you know something is up. And this can be a very soothing touch if you're struggling to get to sleep or you're feeling a bit anxious. I use this all of the time with patients. It's probably the number one go-to technique. The next technique, and you can still leave your hand in your heart just to kind of absorb it in, is self-compassion. So if you can imagine your heart floating within the chest cavity, getting a little bit lighter, and gently connecting with yourself in a compassionate way. And compassion is about bringing kindness to suffering. That is the definition of compassion. So where there is suffering, where there is unease or ill-ease, it's about being kind to that, because it's difficult to suffer. It's difficult to have a cardiac diagnosis or a condition. So it's just bringing some empathy and kindness to that. And just seeing how that lands in your heart. And a third technique I would urge you to pursue, I don't have it on the system today because it's about 20 minutes long, but you can go on YouTube or, those Headspace apps, things like that. And the body scan is really, really helpful after something like this occurring. Because as you focus on the body in these body scans, they're called, just Google it, it starts to bring us down into our body. And our body is a lot calmer than our mind most of the time, but we live in our mind most of the time. Practicing something like a body scan as often as a daily practice is really helpful in allowing the body to settle, because, our bodies are strong, our bodies are resilient. They have ways of recovering that we will never fully understand. So it's about coming down into the body and trusting that your body does actually have your back, because you're here listening to me this evening. So there are 3 techniques that you can use, which can be really, really helpful. The first 2, they're very helpful in the moment. Okay. I just wanted to add in to the end of this talk, the piece around camaraderie. Sorry, the piece, I've jumped ahead, around the pandemic, because working in cardiac care, I've seen some changes in the last 12 to 15 months that I think it's worth bringing to people's attention. Ordinarily, someone has an event, someone has a diagnosis, they come to the cardiac rehab program, certainly in telehospital. And normally it's run with 8 people in a reasonably small room. There's a couple of nurses involved, a physio. And they do this in a group together. And what I've seen over the years, you'll see two or three lads getting pally and another two or three getting pally over there, and they're off having coffee or they're having fun in the changing room afterwards. Through that experience, people, have the peer support, they see other people improving, they see themselves improving. And that is absent for people at the moment. So I've had people say, am I the only one who's experiencing this? And I'm having to say, actually, everyone's experiencing it, but you don't get to talk to one another about it. So I suppose there's something about it. I see that as an unfortunate gap as a result of the COVID-19, that camaraderie. I suppose equally, it, when I give a talk like this in the hospital, I give it in person, and we would have about 20 to 25 people who've been through a diagnosis of some sort. And a lot of the time I won't even get through the talk because I'll be asking people for their feedback, or what have they had a similar experience, different experience, and the chat gets going. So automatically people are hearing, oh, that one over there, I feel a bit like that, or I felt a bit like him. And so they're starting to realize, oh, I'm not on my own here, and I'm not going mad actually. So I suppose that's a goal of the Hearts and Minds, is that peer support gets connected. We don't have that in the current climate, and it's unfortunate. This is the best we can do. I suppose I worked with a gentleman last year, and he talked about his experience that he said it was a bad year to be sick. He had a heart attack, and he felt it was overshadowed by the needs of COVID. So he would have gone to his outpatients, to the consultant, all of those appointments, and he was dealing with people in masks and goggles, with Perspex screen, and he just said that he felt there was such a distance, and I suppose I would see with cardiac care in particular, when we think about the heart, what does the heart need? It needs warmth, it needs connection, it needs presence of others. So we're having to block that, which is difficult at the current time, I suppose equally, people aren't getting an opportunity to link up with their pals, with their friends, to have a hug from a friend that they haven't seen in a while, to return to normal living. Because when something happens, it's like the world shrinks into ourselves. And then you have something like a holiday, you have a communion, you have a dinner party, and you're invited along and you go. And that day is not about the heart condition. That day is about the communion. That day is about the picnic, whatever it is, and you feel all the better for that. Okay. So that kind of time off is a natural healing mechanism. And that's not available to people. So they're not getting the natural reset that it has been available to patients. So I suppose I would say to people, be very gentle with yourselves in this current context, because it is a different recovery. As I said, I'm noticing that because people aren't getting their outpatients as quickly, because they're not getting onto cardiac rehab programs so quickly, they are further along in their physical recovery, perhaps, than they might be in their emotional recovery. So people might be saying, I'm 6 months along, I should be better. But from a psychological perspective, I'm recognizing that people need a certain amount of support, and if a part of that support is missing, it may crop up later. So sometimes somebody could be as raw after a diagnosis 6 months or a year later than they would be on the first day, because it hasn't been processed. Okay. And I suppose the last thing I would say is that when something happens, I mentioned earlier, the rug gets pulled from under you. And when that happens, the job is to get the rug right way up, or get yourself standing right back up again. Okay, to reorient for the world to look somewhat predictable. You're trying to do that in a world that is upside down. So right now, it's a difficult time to look for safety and to look for psychological safety, because that is not all around us, and so there's something about, I would urge people to really be very gentle with themselves at the current time, because it is different. And in some ways it is harder. Okay. So really there's a need there for sort of like recognition of the time, recognition of the context. So I'd like to thank you now for your attention. I really hope that talk has been of benefit in some ways. As I said, parts you will recognize, parts you will say, oh, that's not really me at all. But I do hope you've taken something heartwarming from it. and can come to practice some of those techniques, particularly the hand on the heart. Um, because I suppose I have learned over the years that when people understand their reaction, they can cope with it better. Um, so I really hope that has been of benefit, and thank you so much for your attention. Take care.